11:47 p.m. The 48th floor of Meridian Technologies had a particular quality of silence in the final hours before midnight, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of machines working, of servers breathing behind reinforced walls, of electricity, moving through 10,000 circuits in patterns that cost more money per second than most people earned in a year. Ethan Calloway moved through that silence with a mop. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested an earlier life of physical work, with hands that were too careful to belong to someone who had spent his whole career pushing a cart down office corridors. His hair was the color of iron. His face held the particular stillness of a man who had learned, over a very long time, not to let the world see what he was thinking. He wore the gray uniform of Meridian's contracted cleaning service Apex Facility Solutions. The embroidered patch on his chest said, and he moved his mop across the polished concrete floor of the main engineering corridor in long, deliberate strokes. Economy of motion, no wasted effort. He had cleaned this floor 211 nights in a row, and he had learned its exact dimensions, its drainage gradient, the precise angle at which water beaded against the baseboard near the server room entrance. He noticed things like that. He had always noticed things like that. At 11:47, the lights changed. Not all of them, just the bank of status monitors above the central operations desk, which had glowed steady green for as long as Ethan could remember. They went red, one after another, cascade style, the way dominoes fall when the first one tips. Ethan stopped mopping. He looked at the error codes scrolling across the primary display. He read them the way a musician reads sheet music, not laboriously, working out each note, but all at once. The whole pattern resolving into meaning in the space of a single breath. Then he looked away. He placed his hands back on the mop handle and continued cleaning, because nobody had asked him. Ethan had started at Meridian Technologies 8 months ago, on a Tuesday in March, during the kind of cold, wet rain that made Chicago feel like a city that had given up. He had taken the bus from his apartment in Pilsen, 37 minutes door to lobby, if the 18 line was running on schedule, and he had presented himself at the service entrance at exactly 9:55 p.m., 5 minutes before his shift began. The supervisor, who processed his paperwork, a heavy-set man named Gary, who smelled like vending machine coffee, had looked at Ethan's application with the particular expression of someone who didn't know what to make of what he was reading. Says, "Here you were an engineer." "A long time ago," Ethan said. "What kind?" "Software, systems architecture." Gary had looked at him for a moment, then back at the form. "Why are you applying for a cleaning position?" "I need the insurance," Ethan said. And that was true. It was also, like most of what Ethan said, the minimum required truth, the answer that answered the question without opening any other questions. Gary shrugged and gave him his uniform. The work itself was not difficult. Ethan had been surprised, in the beginning, by how much he didn't mind it, the physical simplicity of it, the clear start and clear finish, the satisfaction of moving through a space and leaving it better than he found it. There was an honesty to cleaning that he had not expected. The building was dirty. He cleaned it. The building was less dirty. Cause and effect. Unambiguous and complete. He was good at it. In the methodical way, he was good at everything he applied himself to. He mapped the floor plan of the 48th level in his first week, noting the load-bearing columns, the cable conduit runs, the placement of the emergency power relays. He learned the rhythm of the night security rotations, the maintenance schedules for the HVAC units, the particular quirks of the men's restroom on the north end, whose pressure regulator ran about 8 pounds low and made the third toilet from the door flush with a sound like someone clearing their throat. He learned these things not because he intended to do anything with them, but because he couldn't stop himself from learning them. His mind moved toward the functional logic of systems, the way water moved toward low ground. It was the oldest habit he had. The day shift employees largely didn't see him. He arrived after most of them left and departed before the earliest arrivals came in. He was part of the infrastructure of the building, like the plumbing or the fire suppression system present, essential in a background sort of way, and completely invisible. The younger engineers who occasionally worked late sometimes spoke in front of him with the unself-consciousness of people who have forgotten that other people can hear. He listened, not to gather information, but because sound was something his mind automatically processed and filed. The way his eyes automatically read error codes on monitors that no one had asked him to read. He had learned, in 8 months, that Meridian's AI division was 6 weeks away from its most significant product launch in company history. That the system they were launching, an adaptive decision architecture they called ARIA, had been built on a foundation that Ethan recognized in a way he couldn't quite articulate, the way you might recognize a piece of music you hadn't heard in 20 years. That the lead engineers were brilliant and hardworking, and under enormous pressure, and that there was a flaw in the synchronization layer that none of them had found yet. He knew because he had watched them work, and because some patterns of error, once you'd seen them, were impossible to unsee. He had not said anything. Nobody had asked him. He cleaned his floors. He clocked out at 5 in the morning. He took the bus home to Pilsen in the gray early light. The apartment on West 21st Street had 2 bedrooms and a view of the parking structure across the alley. It was clean in the way that Ethan kept everything clean deliberately, without fuss, every object in its place. He had lived there for 4 years, since after the bankruptcy, since the settlement, since the period he didn't talk about. His wife, Helen, was usually awake when he came in. She had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 11 years ago. The relapsing-remitting variety, which meant that her condition moved through cycles of relative stability and sudden, unpredictable decline. She managed it with a regimen of medications that cost, without insurance, somewhere north of $4,000 a month. She was 61 years old and still beautiful in a way that sometimes caught Ethan off guard. The particular beauty of someone who had faced something very hard and refused to let it make her bitter. "How was it?" she asked him. On the morning after the night the monitors went red. She was in the kitchen, working through her stretches at the counter. A routine her physical therapist had designed to manage the stiffness in her left side. She moved through them methodically, without complaint. Helen had never been a person who complained. "Quiet," Ethan said. He set his bag by the door and started water for coffee. Mostly quiet. Mostly. He glanced at her. She was watching him with the specific attention she deployed when she knew he was editing something out. There was a system failure around midnight. The engineering team handled it. Did they? Eventually, Helen was quiet for a moment, working through a shoulder rotation. "You saw something." "I see a lot of things." Ethan. He was quiet for a long time, watching the water begin to steam. Outside, a garbage truck moved through the alley, its mechanical groan filling the kitchen for several seconds. "It was a synchronization error in their AI architecture," he said finally. "A race condition in the memory management layer. The kind of thing you'd catch in a thorough code audit, but they hadn't caught it." "No. And you didn't tell them." "I clean floors, Helen. Nobody asks the floor cleaner about race conditions in AI architecture." She stopped her stretches and turned to look at him. She had gray eyes that were direct and a little merciless when she chose to use them that way. "Do you remember," she said, "what it felt like to be the person people asked?" Ethan set 2 mugs on the counter with more care than the action required. His hands were very steady. "Yes," he said. "I remember." He did not say, "That's exactly why I don't want to go back." He taped a new medication reminder to the refrigerator door, beside the existing one. He ate a piece of toast, standing at the counter. He went to bed at 6:30, and lay in the gray morning light, and looked at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a long time. Claire Morgan had been named CEO of Meridian Technologies at 37, which made her the youngest person to hold the position in the company's 22-year history, and the subject of a profile in a business magazine that her assistant had framed and hung in the reception area outside her office, which Claire found mortifying and had never had removed, because doing so would have required explaining why. She was 41 now. She had spent the past 4 years learning, in granular and sometimes excruciating detail, the difference between being very good at her job and being the person responsible for every decision made by 4,000 people who were good at their jobs. The ARIA launch was the most important thing she had ever done. Not for the money, though. The contracts already signed represented the largest revenue event in Meridian's history, but because it was the culmination of 6 years of work that had begun before she was CEO, work that her predecessor had started, and she had shepherded through 3 rounds of pivots, 2 near-catastrophic funding crunches, and 1 hostile acquisition attempt that she had defeated by a margin narrow enough that she still occasionally woke at 2 a.m. thinking about it. On the evening after the synchronization failure, she called her head of engineering, a precise and exhausted man named Daniel Whitmore, into her office and asked him to explain what had happened. He explained for 12 minutes, using words like cascading timeout and thread lock and log fragmentation. He was technically accurate and comprehensively uninformative. Any point, any quote, any wasn't to worse, Claire asked. We didn't lose data. That's not what I asked. Daniel paused. We came close enough that I've ordered a full audit of the synchronization layer before we proceed. How long? 2 weeks, minimum, possibly 3. Claire looked at her desk. The launch was in 6 weeks. 3 weeks of audit left 3 weeks of remediation time if anything was found, which was not enough if anything significant was found. Was this a known risk? Another pause. Shorter, but meaningful. There were theoretical scenarios in which a high-load synchronization failure could produce these symptoms. They were assessed as low probability. Assessed by whom? The team. Claire nodded slowly. Okay. Start the audit. Keep me informed, at every milestone, not just the end. After Daniel left, she sat for a while at her desk in the quiet office. 48th floor. Corner position. Floor-to-ceiling windows, facing north and east. The city spread out below her in its nighttime grid of orange and white, the lake of vast darkness beyond. She had grown up in a house near that lake. Her father had taken her there on Sunday mornings to watch the ships. Her father had been an engineer. One of the best, people still said, who had ever worked in the field of applied systems architecture in the early years of AI development. He had died 6 years ago, before she was named CEO. Before ARIA existed as anything but a concept. Before she had proven any of the things she had spent the last 4 years proving. She missed him with a specific and daily weight. The way you miss someone who would have understood exactly what you were going through. She stayed in the office until after midnight, reading audit reports and pretending she wasn't listening to the sound of a mop moving back and forth down the corridor outside her door. The sound was steady and patient, unhurried. There was something almost meditative about it, the long stroke forward, the pause, the long stroke back, and Claire found herself tracking it without intending to. The way you track a clock in a quiet room. She wondered, without quite deciding to wonder it, what a person thought about during 8 hours of that work. Whether they listened to music, or let their mind go somewhere else, or whether they stayed present in the physical simplicity of the task, and found that sufficient. She had never had a job that required only her body. Every position she had held since her first internship at 22 had required the specific and exhausting management of other people's expectations, other people's anxieties, other people's professional insecurities. She was good at it. She had learned to be good at it in the way you learn to be good at anything that you did every day for 20 years. But she had never fully made her peace with the cost of it, which was that you spent a great deal of your mental life managing things that had nothing to do with the work itself. The mop in the corridor did not sound like it was managing anything. The second failure was worse. It happened on a Thursday, 9 days into the audit, at 11:23 p.m. Ethan heard the alarms from the east corridor, a low, repeating tone, not loud but insistent, and pushed his cart to the window of the engineering bay to see what was happening. What was happening was everything at once. The central ARIA development cluster occupied a glass-walled room the size of a tennis court, visible from the corridor through safety glass that was supposed to be soundproofed but was not quite. Inside, Ethan could see 7 engineers at their stations, and the quality of their movement had changed from focused to frantic in the way that distinguished real emergencies from the minor crises that engineers treated as emergencies. Real emergencies had a particular texture of helplessness, people talking over each other, hands running through hair, the specific paralysis that came from knowing the problem was large and not knowing where it started. The primary display wall showed cascading red. Aria's core process had entered an uncontrolled loop. Ethan could see it from the hallway. The recursive error log scrolling faster than anyone could read it. The memory allocation climbing toward the ceiling in a graph that looked like the side of a building. A senior engineer named Marcus Ethan had learned his name from 7 months of proximity was on the phone, visibly arguing with someone. 2 younger engineers were trying to implement what appeared to be an emergency rollback, which was the right instinct but the wrong entry point. They were hitting the symptom instead of the cause. Daniel Whitmore arrived at 11:31, still in his jacket, tie loosened. He looked at the displays for 45 seconds without speaking, which told Ethan something about Daniel Whitmore. He was a man who needed to understand before he acted, which was a virtue that became a liability under certain kinds of time pressure. The cause was not subtle. Once you knew what you were looking for, it was an edge case in the handoff protocol between Aria's decision layer and its memory allocation manager, a sequence that would only trigger under specific conditions of simultaneous high load and thread contention, conditions that had been theoretically possible but practically improbable until the audit process itself had introduced the exact load pattern required to make them actual. The audit had broken the thing it was trying to fix. Ethan watched this understanding fail to develop in the room behind the glass. He watched Marcus end his phone call and start another one. He watched Daniel write something on a whiteboard that was the right category of solution but the wrong specific implementation. He watched a young engineer with a ponytail he'd heard the others call her Becca stare at her screen with the focused intensity of someone who was very close to something but couldn't quite find it. He watched the memory allocation graph continue to climb. At 11:44, the first server partition went offline. At 11:47, Claire Morgan came through the door at the end of the corridor, still in her coat, her phone at her ear. She had been called in, which meant the situation had escalated from engineering problem to executive problem, which meant that the people in that room had been working on it for 24 minutes and had not solved it. She spoke to Daniel. Daniel gestured at the displays. Claire looked at the displays with an expression that Ethan, watching from the corridor, read as someone absorbing the full weight of the situation without letting it show on her face. Becca looked up from her screen. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Claire. And then, for a reason Ethan would never fully understand, she looked through the glass at the corridor. She looked at Ethan. He was standing very still, his hands on the cart handle. He realized, in that moment, that he had been watching the problem on the displays for 24 minutes, that he had known the solution for approximately 22 of those minutes, and that nobody was going to ask him, unless he moved first. He took a piece of glass cleaning cloth from his cart. He took a marker from his shirt pocket. He always carried a marker, force of old habit, and he wrote 8 lines on the back of the cloth. 8 lines that were not quite code but were the skeleton of code, the logical structure that the code needed to follow. He held it up to the glass. Becca squinted. She stood up. She walked to the glass and read what he had written, and Ethan watched the expression on her face change in the specific way that a face changes when a solution that seemed impossible reveals itself as not only possible but obvious. She turned and said something to Daniel. The door opened. Daniel came into the corridor with Claire behind him and 3 engineers behind her. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the cloth in Ethan's hand. He looked at it for a long moment, with an expression that moved through skepticism, reluctance, and something that was not quite desperation, but was adjacent to it. "May I see that?" he said. Ethan handed it to him. Daniel read it. Claire read it over his shoulder. Becca read it over Claire's shoulder, and then said, quietly, "He's right about the entry point. The handoff lock is in the wrong place. If we redirect the allocation request here," she pointed before the thread contention check, "the loop can't form. That's not how the protocol was designed," Marcus said. "No," Becca said. "That's how it should have been designed." Daniel looked at Ethan. "How do you want to discuss it?" Ethan said. "Or do you want to fix it?" There was a silence. "Fix it," Claire said. It took 11 minutes. Becca implemented the redirect, while Marcus handled the thread lock sequence, and a 3rd engineer named Owen managed the controlled restart of the affected partitions. Ethan stood in the corridor. He did not go in. He had not been invited in, and he understood the distinction. At 12:02 a.m., the memory allocation graph stopped climbing. At 12:04, it began to descend. At 12:07, the first partition came back online. By 12:14, all systems were stable, and the error cascade had resolved to a single correctable fault log that would take 10 minutes to clear. The room behind the glass went through a particular kind of silence, the silence after a very loud noise, when people are still adjusting to the absence of what had been overwhelming them. Ethan capped his marker and put it back in his pocket. He took the cloth back from Daniel, who was still holding it, and returned it to his cart. He moved his cart to the next station on his route. "Wait," Claire said. He stopped. She came to stand a few feet away from him in the corridor. She was tall, and she looked at him directly, and Ethan had the sense that she was a person who had learned to see things accurately, not a common skill, in his experience, among people who had reached her level of institutional authority. "Who are you?" she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "I'm the man who cleans the 48th floor. That's not what I asked." "I know." He held her gaze for a second. Then he turned and pushed his cart toward the south corridor. Behind him, he heard her say something to Daniel, too low to make out. But her voice had a quality he recognized, the focused, very quiet voice of someone who has just decided to find something out. He kept walking. The employment file for Ethan Calloway, as maintained by Apex Facility Solutions, was 3 pages long. It listed his hire date, his shift assignment, his emergency contact Helen Calloway, wife, and a note in the performance review section that read, "Reliable, no complaints." Before Apex, a 3-year gap in employment history. Before the gap, a notation that he had previously worked in software development. No company name, no title, no dates. Claire's assistant, a meticulous young man named Preston, exhausted his standard channels in under 2 hours and came back with nothing useful. It took a researcher from Meridian's legal department, working through a combination of public business records and archived industry publications, 2 full days to find what was actually there. Claire read the report on a Saturday morning, alone in her office. She read it twice. In the mid-90s, a company called Hargrove Systems had been one of the most significant players in early enterprise AI development. Not a household name. This was before AI was a household concept, but known within the industry as the place where some of the most original thinking about adaptive decision systems was being done. Hargrove had employed, from 1991 to 2003, a systems architect named Ethan Calloway, who had risen to lead their core research division and whose work on recursive learning frameworks had been described in a 1999 trade publication as a decade ahead of where everyone else is working. In 2003, Hargrove Systems declared bankruptcy following the collapse of 2 major contracts and allegations of financial mismanagement at the executive level. The company's founders and senior officers were investigated. Several were prosecuted. Ethan Calloway was not among them. He was never charged with anything, but he was named in a civil lawsuit as a co-respondent, and the suit, though eventually dismissed, had taken 4 years to resolve. His name appeared in industry publications through 2003, and then, with no announcement or explanation, stopped appearing. The last mention Claire's researcher found was a brief item in a trade newsletter from the fall of 2004, noting that Ethan Calloway had left the technology sector following the Hargrove dissolution and was not expected to return. Claire put the report down on her desk. She thought about the synchronization fix, the precision of it, the economy, the way it had gone directly to the root without touching anything unnecessary. She thought about the 8 lines on the cloth and how they had contained, in compressed form, a structural insight that her entire engineering team, working under pressure, had missed. She thought about a man eating a piece of toast in a dim kitchen at 5 in the morning before a bus ride to a job that paid him $19.40 an hour. That evening, she walked the entire 48th floor at 11:30 p.m. She found Ethan in the east corridor, systematically cleaning the baseboards. He looked up when he heard her coming and waited with the patience of someone who had been expecting this. "Hargrove Systems," she said. He looked at her without expression. You built adaptive decision frameworks before most people knew what that meant. I worked for a company that went under, he said. It was a long time ago, Ethan, Miss Morgan. He said it without heat, but with finality. I appreciate you coming down here. I do. But there is nothing in what happened the other night that requires any further discussion. I disagree. That's your right. He turned back to the baseboard. Claire stood there for a moment, watching him work. Then she said, My father was in the field. Early AI systems. He knew some of the people from that era. Ethan's hands slowed, very slightly, then continued. What was his name? He asked. James Morgan. A pause. Not a surprised pause, more like the pause of someone adjusting to an unexpected wait. I knew him, Ethan said. He did not say anything else. Claire waited. And when it became clear that he was done, she said goodnight and walked back toward her office. What had actually happened at Hargrove Systems, in the version that existed in documents rather than rumors, was this. The company's CFO had been running a parallel funding scheme for 3 years before anyone noticed. He had been drawing on development accounts to finance the personal investment portfolio of Hargrove's founding CEO, who had known nothing about it and subsequently cooperated with investigators. When the scheme collapsed, it took the company's liquidity with it in under 90 days. The 2 contracts that canceled did so not because of anything Hargrove's engineers had done wrong, but because no rational client maintains a contract with a company that cannot make payroll. Ethan Callaway had not been part of any of this. He had been, during those 3 years, leading his research division and producing the foundational work that 3 separate companies, including, in an indirect but traceable line, Meridian Technologies would later build significant portions of their AI architectures upon. He had also, during those 3 years, been watching his son die. Thomas Callaway had been diagnosed with leukemia at age 9 in 2001. He had died in May of 2003, 7 weeks before Hargrove filed for bankruptcy. He was 11 years old. He had liked baseball and building things, and a particular television program about ocean exploration that he and his father watched together on Sunday evenings. Ethan had been present at both events, his son's death and the company's collapse in the worst possible sequence. The grief of losing Thomas had barely begun to process when the litigation began, and the name he had spent 15 years building was attached to the collapse and the fraud and the failure, all of it, though none of it had been his. He had fought the civil suit. He had won, but winning a lawsuit that never should have been filed cost 4 years and a sum of money that, combined with the loss of the Hargrove work that represented the majority of his professional network and reputation, left him in a position that required starting over. And starting over. At 41, with a wife managing a recent diagnosis and a grief that had no bottom to it. He had made calculations about what he could and could not sustain. He had chosen Helen. He had chosen quiet. He had chosen not to go back into a world that had taken the best 15 years of his working life and used them to build things that bore other people's names, then blamed him when the people who managed the money turned out to be criminals. He had not been angry about it, or not only angry, he had been tired in a way that anger doesn't describe. He had not known, when he took the job at Apex, that his route would include the 48th floor of Meridian Technologies. He had not recognized, at first, the shape of what he saw in their systems, the familiar logic of the recursive frameworks, the specific architectural choices that echoed choices he had made in a lab in Chicago in 1997. Recognition had crept up on him gradually, over months, and when he finally understood what he was looking at, he had felt something he was not prepared for. He had felt proud, not of himself, of the idea, of the fact that it had survived, that people had taken it and built on it and carried it forward, that the work had mattered even when everything else had gone wrong. He had not expected to feel that. Word traveled, as it always does in enclosed professional environments, at a speed that bears no relationship to the official communication channels. By Friday morning, 4 days after the second system failure, most of the engineering division knew that the cleaning staff had contributed to the emergency resolution. By Friday afternoon, the version circulating in the executive suite had been processed through enough layers of institutional anxiety to emerge as something closer to A janitor did something on the night of the failure, and we don't fully understand what. The chair of Meridian's board of directors was a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had been in technology investment for 30 years and had a gift for identifying the narrative aspects of events that were most likely to cause problems with people who controlled large amounts of money. He called Claire on Friday afternoon. "I've been hearing things," he said. "I'd be happy to send you a summary of what happened," Claire said. "What I've been hearing," Gerald said, "is that there was a significant system failure, that your engineering team failed to resolve it within an acceptable time frame, and that a member of your facility services staff was involved in the resolution in some capacity. That's a reasonable summary of events. Claire." His voice had the quality of a man setting down something heavy and breakable. "We are 6 weeks from the most important product launch in this company's history. This is not the moment for stories that suggest our engineering team can't manage their own systems. Our engineering team managed the system. They needed a second perspective. From a janitor, from a man who happens to clean floors, and also happens to have 20-odd years of experience in systems architecture." A pause. "I want this handled quietly. Define. Another pause. Longer. The individual in question should probably not continue in his current role here." Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, Chicago was a gray afternoon. The lake, the color of pewter. The traffic on the street below moving in its patient stop and go. "Gerald," she said, "I'm not going to fire a man for knowing more than we expected him to. I'm not suggesting. I know what you're suggesting. My answer is no." She kept her voice very even. "If this comes to a board discussion, I'll make the case in those terms, but I'd prefer to avoid wasting everyone's time." The call ended shortly afterward. Claire sat for a while with her phone on the desk. She thought about what it meant that her first instinct, before the board's concern, before the optics, before any of the institutional calculations, had been straightforward. A man who had been treated as invisible had done something valuable, and the correct response was to see him, not to manage him, not to mitigate the awkwardness of his having exposed a gap in the team's knowledge, to actually look at him. Her father had told her something, once, about the engineers he most respected. He had said, "The best ones are the ones who care about the problem more than the credit. They're rare. When you find one, don't let them go." She pulled up Ethan's personnel file and looked at it for a long time. James Morgan had died of a cardiac event at 64, while sitting at his desk in the study of his house near the lake. His death had been fast, the doctors said, which was what people said when they meant that the person had not suffered, though Claire had found little comfort in this beyond the factual. Her father had died alone in his study, which was where he had spent the majority of his waking hours for 40 years, and the fact of his being found there by her mother 3 hours later was something she had never fully been able to set aside. He had left, in addition to the standard estate documents, a small hard drive that his attorney had delivered to Claire with a note. For Claire. When it seems right. She had watched the videos on the drive twice. There were 4 of them, recording sessions of varying length. Her father in his study talking directly to a camera set up on his desk. They were personal and practical, and not quite what she had expected, and exactly what she should have expected from a man who was more comfortable with systems and plans than with sentiment. She had not watched them a third time. She had put the drive in the bottom drawer of her desk at home, under a stack of the industry journals she never quite got around to reading. On the Saturday after the board call, she drove to her parents' house. Her mother still lived there, and retrieved the drive. She brought it back to her apartment and set her laptop on the kitchen table and opened it. The 4th video was 18 minutes long. She had watched it twice before without fully understanding why he had included it. She watched it again now. Most of it was practical reflections on what he had learned about building teams, about institutional culture, about the difference between people who understood the problem and people who understood the politics of the problem. The kind of thing her father communicated most naturally when he framed it as analysis rather than advice. At the 13-minute mark, he said, "I want to talk about someone you may never meet. His name is Ethan Calloway. We worked together briefly, through mutual colleagues, in the late 90s. He was the most naturally gifted systems architect I ever encountered. And I say that having known some very gifted people, he had the specific quality of seeing the whole structure of a problem at once, not just the part that was presenting as the symptom. It's a rare thing. Most people learn it, if they learn it at all, slowly and with great effort. For Calloway, it seemed to be the way he was built. Claire set her coffee mug down. Hargrove was a terrible situation. Her father continued. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what happened to his reputation during the litigation was unjust. I tried to help, I made some calls, but by the time I understood the full situation, he had already decided to leave the field, and I wasn't able to reach him. He was dealing with things that had nothing to do with technology. And I think the professional loss, as serious as it was the smaller of the losses he was carrying. He paused, looking off camera briefly. I don't know where he is now. I hope he's all right. But I wanted to say this, because I never said it to him directly. The work he did at Hargrove was foundational. It didn't disappear when the company did. The ideas spread the way good ideas do through the people who'd encountered them, who carried them into the next place. And the next. If you trace the lineage of some of what we now take for granted in adaptive AI design, you find his fingerprints on the origin. He probably knows this, but I doubt anyone has told him. He looked back at the camera. If you ever encounter him in the world of systems architecture, however large it seems, is actually quite small. Listen to what he says, and tell him that James Morgan thought the field was the poorer for his absence. The video ended. Claire sat at her kitchen table for a long time in the quiet apartment. The lake was visible from her window, the same lake she had grown up beside, the same water her father had taken her to see on Sunday mornings. She was crying before she fully realized she had started, the way you cry when something closes a loop you didn't know had been open. She found him in the break room on the 48th floor, on a Monday evening at 10 p.m. He was eating a sandwich and reading a folded newspaper with the absorption of someone who had made peace with eating alone. The room was empty, except for him. The overhead light was the flat, institutional white of all break rooms everywhere. He looked up when she came in. He did not seem surprised. Claire sat down across from him. She put the drive on the table between them. She said, "My father left me some videos. In one of them, he talks about you." Ethan looked at the drive. He did not touch it. What does he say? That you were the most gifted systems architect he ever met. That what happened at Hargrove was unjust. That the field was the poorer for your absence. She paused. And that if I ever encountered you, I should listen to what you had to say. The break room hummed with the particular quiet of a large building at night. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine made a brief mechanical sound and went still. Ethan looked at the table. Something moved across his face, not quite grief, not quite relief. Something that required both words, and neither one exactly. James Morgan was a good man, he said finally. He was. He tried to help. After. I know that. I wasn't in a position to. He stopped. Began again. There was a lot happening at once. I wasn't managing any of it particularly well. I know, Claire said. I read the research report, and I understand the timeline. He was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have been 31 this year. It was the first time he had said his son's name out loud, to anyone outside his own home in a very long time. He was aware of this in the particular way that you are aware of a door opening after a long closure. Claire said nothing. She understood, from the way he had said it, that nothing was the correct response. After a while, Ethan looked up. "What do you want, Miss Morgan?" "I want you to talk to my engineering team," she said. Not as a janitor and not as a miracle worker. As someone who has been watching their system for 8 months and has things to tell them, formally I mean, in a room where they take notes. And then, that depends on what you want. If you want to go back to pushing a cart, I'll make sure it's the best compensated cart in the facility. If you want something else, we can talk about what that looks like. Ethan looked at her steadily. I'm not interested in a title. I know. I'm not interested in credit. I know that too. The insurance is important. Helen, my wife. I know about Helen. Whatever she needs, that's handled. That's not conditional on anything. He absorbed this without visible reaction. Which Claire was beginning to understand was his way of receiving things that mattered to him most. "Let me talk to her," he said. Claire nodded. "And I want to be clear about something." He folded his newspaper very precisely, aligning the edges. "I'm not going back to the field. I'm 53 years old and I left for reasons that were good reasons. But there are things I see in your system that your team should know. Gaps in the architecture, not just bugs, but structural assumptions that will cause problems in production if nobody addresses them. I can explain what they are. Whether that constitutes consulting or teaching or something else, I don't particularly care. It constitutes whatever you want to call it," Claire said. He nodded once. They sat for a moment in the humming quiet. "Your father," Ethan said. "He mentioned me in the video." "Yes. He said the field was the poorer for my absence." "Yes." Another silence. And then, very quietly, "He never told me that." "I know," Claire said. "He told me instead." I think that was the point. 3 weeks later, Ethan Calloway walked into a conference room on the 48th floor and spent 4 hours with Meridian's engineering team. He had spent the night before at the kitchen table with Helen, going over what he planned to say. She had listened with her coffee mug held in both hands and her eyes on him with that particular steadiness she deployed when she wanted him to know she was paying full attention. When he finished, she had been quiet for a moment. "You sound like yourself again," she said. He had not known what to say to that. He had said, "I'm not sure I know what that means anymore." "Yes, you do," she said. And she was right. As she generally was about the things that mattered. He had no title. He had no business cards. He carried a legal pad and 2 pens, because he had always carried 2 pens, and he sat at the head of the table, not because anyone had specifically assigned him that seat, but because he arrived first, and it was the seat closest to the whiteboard. He had brought a thermos of coffee from home, the good kind that Helen insisted on buying even when money was tighter than it should have been, because she said that a man who was going to do serious thinking deserved serious coffee. He had laughed when she said it. He had not laughed very easily in a long time, and the sound of it in their small kitchen had surprised them both. He was not there to impress them. He was there to tell them what he had observed. And he did so in the same methodical, economical way he did everything, starting with what was working, because you needed to understand what you were protecting before you talked about what was at risk. The team listened with the particular quality of attention that comes from a combination of intellectual respect and chastened awareness that the person talking knows something they had missed. Becca, he had noticed, was the fastest. She asked the best questions, and she was not afraid to tell him when she disagreed, which was the thing he had always valued most in a collaborator. He spent 2 more days with them that week, and then 2 days the following week, and then 1 afternoon on a rotating basis after that. He was never in the building during his old shift hours. He was not sure whether this was meaningful or simply convenient, and he decided not to think too carefully about it. He did not push a cart anymore. He continued to use the service entrance, because the service entrance was quieter, and he was a man who liked quiet. One afternoon in the 4th week, he brought coffee into the engineering bay, a habit from 20 years of lab culture that had reasserted itself without any particular decision on his part. He set a cup at each station, the way he had always done it, reading the room to know who needed refills before they did. A young engineer named Oliver looked up with mild alarm and said, "Sir, you don't have to do that." Ethan considered this. "Old habit," he said. He set down the last cup and added, "Also, the coffee from the machine on this floor is terrible. Someone should submit a work order." Oliver looked at him for a moment, not quite sure how to respond, and then laughed. It was the easy, surprised laugh of someone who had been expecting something formal and received something human instead. Ethan went back to the whiteboard. On the evening of the area launch, Claire found him standing at the window at the end of the main corridor, the north-facing window, the one with the best view of the lake. He was in street clothes, having already handed off his lanyard to Preston's desk, and he was looking out at the city in the way of someone who has not been permitted to stop moving for a long time, and is only now allowing himself to be still. "How does it feel?" Claire asked. Ask me in a year, he said. When we see what the system actually does in production. I meant tonight. He was quiet for a moment. The lake was very dark at this hour, and the city's lights made a wide, bright ring around its edge. Strange, he said. In a way I can't account for. Claire nodded. She stood beside him and looked out at the city. Below them, traffic moved in its patient patterns, and the lake held its darkness. And the building breathed around them in its electrical, mechanical way. My father was right, she said. Ethan looked at her. About what you said in there today. About the adaptive threshold calibration. He would have agreed with every word of it. Ethan turned back to the window. Something shifted in his face, very small, very controlled. The movement of a man adjusting to a weight that has been set down rather than picked up. He was a good engineer, Ethan said, and a good person. The combination is rarer than it should be. Yes, Claire said. They stood there for a while in the comfortable quiet that settles between people who have said the necessary things and have no need to fill the silence with anything more. Below, the city went about its business. On 48, the servers ran their processes, and Aria moved through its first live cycles. And somewhere in the code, if you traced it back far enough, through the iterations and the rewrites and the years of accumulated work, you found the original logic, the foundational structure, the set of ideas that had begun in a lab in the mid-90s, when a man who believed in the problem more than the credit had worked very late on something he thought might matter. It had mattered. Ethan Calloway looked out at the lake and did not say this out loud. He did not need to. The building said it for him. In the quiet, persistent language of things that endure.